Blackout. Shortly after his wireless incident, James quickly befriended the other memorial engines, among them Thomas's friend Green Arrow, and the very proud engine Winston Churchill. The Fat Controller wasn't happy, of course, but I couldn't go unnoticed, you understand, James said, chuckling lightly. You certainly did bring a lot of colour with you, added Green Arrow. There aren't many red engines in the collection. You'd stand out very clearly in the Blackout tomorrow, said Defiant. What's out? James asked. The Blackout, explained Defiant. It's one of the biggest parts of the memorial event. During the war, whenever there was an air raid, a loud siren would wail, telling everyone to turn off their lights if one of the large warplanes flew above us. James snorted. That's the sort of thing Henry would do. Anyone would, but it certainly saved our side rods throughout the war, said Green Arrow with feeling. It was difficult to move around in pitch blackness. Luckily, we won't have to tomorrow. Whatever for? The Blackout's going to take place tomorrow night, said Defiant. As a reenactment. The manager wants us to stay here. It would be too dangerous for us to operate at night. The next day, James and Defiant brought a long train in from the suburbs to York, full of visitors that had all come to see the Blackout. A large banner had been put up in the station building. Blitz Blackout Spectacular, tonight at 9 sharp. This made James feel very excited. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted as the diesel shunter bustled in, shunting 2 heavy wagons. Large, dirty tanks were chained to them, dripping oil from underneath. What are they for? Asked James. They're going to lead the parade after the fireworks and the lights come back on, explained the diesel. If you ask me, they should be sent back to the War Museum. Horrible dirty things have been leaking all over me. Just then, the guard blew his whistle, and James and Defiant were off again. But as they rolled over the points where the diesel had passed, James felt something wet and slippery splash against his wheels. Ooh! He hissed, feeling most uncomfortable. That diesel was right. Those things ought to be sent back before they cause an accident. When night came, the streets outside the station were packed with crowds. There were 15 minutes to go until the Blackout. James was standing beside the coaling stage, watching everything excitedly. We'd better get back to the sheds before the Blackout begins, said his driver. It'd be too dangerous to stay here. Rubbish, said James swiftly. We'll be fine. I'm not a scaredy cab like silly old Henry. But his driver didn't agree, and James soon found himself sulking in the shed between Defiant and Green Arrow. This is silly, he complained. I'm not afraid of the dark. Defiant laughed. It's better to be safe than sorry. Back in those days, we had to go no matter what. All the same, it's too dangerous to go out when it's too dark to see. Just then, the museum curator arrived. Something's just come up. I need an engine to take the tanks back to the warehouse. It's too dangerous to leave them here, especially with the firework display later on. James jumped at the opportunity. I'll do it, sir. All right then, but your headlamps won't be any good, especially with the Blackout just about to start. The men will tell you where to go, so take care. James huffily promised and bustled out into the yard. He'd better be careful, whispered Green Arrow to Defiant. The rails are slippery from those tanks, and unless you know a way around this yard, you're in trouble. As soon as James was across the yard, he heard the crowd announcing the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There was a loud cheer, and the yard floodlights were shut off. At first, James was surprised, but as soon as his eyes adjusted to the dark, his confidence rose again. See? Easy peasy, he boasted. Workmen with lamps guided James to the siding by the station where the wagons carrying the tanks stood. They were still leaking dreadfully. James buffered up and waited to set off again. He didn't appreciate the workmen milling around him, waving their arms and giving instructions on where to go. "I know this yard already," James protested. "Can't they just leave me alone?" "No," said the driver firmly. "Don't be silly. Now get going." As they began to move the heavy tanks out of the siding, the workmen continued to walk in front and beside him, telling him where to go. Thankfully, the yard was clear, and the points were set to lead James to the warehouse. But James had other plans in mind. The moment they approached a set of points, the dark shape of the warehouse loomed ahead. "I don't need the men for this," he thought. "I can manage from here." And he suddenly picked up speed, much to the surprise of his driver, fireman, and the workmen. "What are you doing? Stop!" yelled his driver. James didn't listen, nor did he see the workmen shouting after him as he bustled towards the warehouse. "This'll show the others what I'm capable of," chortled the red engine. Suddenly, he felt something wet and damp spray his wheels. James had completely forgotten that the tanks on his wagons were still leaking dirty oil. Taken by surprise, he found himself sliding along the rails, pulled by the weight of the tanks before him. Deeper and deeper into the darkness he slid, his driver trying to get him under control. The foreman continued after James, but as he tried to call to him, the wailing air raid siren echoed throughout the yard, and James couldn't hear what he was saying. All of a sudden, there was a crash as the tanks ploughed through the doors, dragging James into the dark building. "Help! Where am I?" James cried in a state of panic. Then the first tank crashed through a set of buffers, disturbing a stack of crates at the end. The topmost crate toppled over and smashed beside the track. What happened next was all a blur in James's memory. All he could remember was Defiant telling him about air raids. Bang! 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 Loud blasts echoed all around him. James shrieked in fright as he desperately tried to get away. "It's an air raid! Help!" he wailed, his wheels slipping frantically. At last, his driver regained control and shut off steam before any more damage was done. Poor James shut his eyes, frozen in fear, as the foreman came towards him through the darkness. "We're being attacked!" cried James. "It's an air raid!" The foreman looked cross. "No, you silly great engine, that's the firework display. You've been diverted into the wrong warehouse by mistake. We tried to tell you that before you left us behind." "Oh," muttered James. He felt very silly indeed. After the fireworks display was over, the museum diesel was sent to help James back to the sheds. His story got there before him, of course, and the engines couldn't help but laugh about his predicament. "Never mind, James," soothed Princess Elizabeth. "At least now you know what it feels like to be in a blackout. Those tanks should have been seen to anyway." "Mind you, do you know what you just had?" Defiant said with a grin. James sighed reluctantly. "What's that?" "Well, with you refusing to listen to the workmen during a blackout, you just had a shock in the dark." "Oh, ha ha, very amusing, I'm sure."